Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to Conflict and Care. This event is part of the Constellations Assemblies program that is curated by Up Projects in partnership with Flat Time House and in association with Liverpool Biennial. My name is Elizabeth Del Prete. I am Senior Curator at Up Projects, and I am a white woman with wavy, long brown hair, wearing a pair of earrings with pink and purple stones, and I'm wearing a white shirt. I go by the pronouns of she, her. The premise of today's event is to explore and reflect on how we manage conflicts when working with communities and on public art projects and visual art projects more generally, and how we navigate and negotiate conflicting agendas, and how we might implement practices of care in an honest and genuine way to address differences. Of course, global conflicts are very much at the forefront of our minds at present, but today's discussion will be focusing on the contexts of public art and social practice and the contradictions that underlie the notion of care. Conflict and Care will be moderated by Morgan Quaintance, an artist and writer based in London. Hi, Morgan. I'm also very excited that Morgan will be joined by artist Jackie Tan and independent curator and curator of the 12th edition of the Liverpool Biennial, Khanyisile Mbongwa. I'm just going to say a few words about Morgan and his background. Morgan Quaintance is a London-based artist and writer. His moving image work has been shown and exhibited widely at festivals and institutions, including the Museum of Modern Arts in New York, McAvoy Foundations for the Arts in San Francisco, Constellations in Sweden, and David Dale in Glasgow, amongst many others. Over the past 40 years, Morgan's critically incisive writings on contemporary art, aesthetics, and socio-political contexts have featured in publications including Art Monthly, The Wire, and The Guardian, and helped shape the landscape of discourse and debate in the UK. From 2012 and 2023, he was a producer and presenter of Studio Visit, an interview-based radio program for London's Resonance FM. Morgan will introduce Jack and Khanyisile shortly. And for more information on the speakers today, you can find a link in the chat that we have just added. Before handing over to the speakers, I just want to mention some briefing virtual housekeeping. So, if you experience any technical issues, please use the chat button at the bottom of your screen to chat privately with our dedicated tech support. If you want to ask the speakers any questions during the event, you can submit them via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ensure they get answered. I know Morgan will be taking questions from the audience throughout the event. So please do use that Q&A button. And then we have closed captions available. And if you would like to read along or have any or have access to a live transcript, please select the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We are recording the event today, which was mentioned at the beginning. And I'm going to hand over to Morgan. I really do hope you enjoy the event. Please, over to you, Morgan. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth, for that intro. And hello to everybody. It's kind of strange because we can't see any of you. So I'm just imagining you all out there. But thanks for joining us for this. So we're quite pushed for time, yeah? So I'm going to be quite quick, but not overly quick. So I'm going to try to say things at a normal, even pace, but be concise and not too rambling. What I'll do is give you a quick sort of 6-minute introduction, which maybe, I suppose, will be my perspective on the theme or subject. And then I'll hand over to Jack and then hand over to Khanyisile, and then we're going to have a general conversation. Rather than waiting right to the end for you to jump in and ask questions, just maybe if we could treat this as a bit of a kind of free forum. So if you have anything that occurs to you while we're talking, just chuck it in the Q&A section, and I'll keep an eye on it and then field questions and put them to Jack or Khanyisile as and when they come in. And yeah, and hopefully we'll get quite a lot done in this period of time that we have. So yeah, just to say, I also have written this. I was going to freestyle it, but because we're doing it to time, I've got to be careful. But before I say this, rather than trying to provide a kind of a constricting overview or definitive reading of the theme, this is just kind of my perspective about it. And that will open its way to Jack's and then Khanyisile's perspectives on the subject. And then after that, hopefully we'll be able to get some of your ideas about this notion of care and conflict, or depending on which way that you're sliding on that spectrum in terms of what you feel is more important to discuss today. So let me just get this doc together so I can speak to you as prepared. All right, so my own interest in care as a concept that seems to now be pervasive stems from an ongoing effort to track shifting institutional and interpersonal behaviours following the political turn that took place across the UK's arts sector in the middle of the 2010s. There's probably a number of different factors contributing to that paradigm shift in our field, and I'm just going to briefly talk through a few of them. So I'd probably argue that there are a series of events that led up to the shift in this country, beginning with the global financial crisis of 2008. So this event caused a fiscal crisis in Britain that resulted in massive cuts to the budgets of regularly funded institutions. Anyone who was working for one around 2010-11 probably remember. So massive cuts and the necessity for those institutions to find cheaper ways of working, to scrap large parts of their programs, cut significant staff numbers, and in some cases reduce the hours and days that they were open each week. The coalition government's age of austerity cut funds to public services, the welfare state, and support provisions for the country's poorer citizens. And in the midst of a gig economy, rife 0 hours contracts, and pervasive precarity, this country's poorer citizens became virtually all of us. Now, as social provisions reduced, a kind of pressure for the arts to step in and take over emerged. Institutions still fielding outmoded programs were facing irrelevance, and so they sought to employ artists and organizations who knew how to respond and were already well versed in community work, activism, politics, participatory art, and any other socially engaged practices. These artists were already engaged in practices of care, and so these practices made their way, and so did the discourse made its way from the margins into the quote-unquote centre. The question now is whether or not the notion of a caring sector is real, or else is it a hollow practice, a performance, or a clear-cut case of virtue signalling? Why must the burden of educating the sector sit with those individuals who were previously marginalised by it? How, in a world rife with conflict, can one attend to rarefied aesthetic questions? And is one even allowed to attend to rarefied aesthetic questions if you are from a marginal subject position? One thing I'd just like to add quickly that I haven't got in my prepared thing is this thing that I've been talking about a lot recently. And it's a statement I heard made by this drag artist called Dynasty Handbag. And she was describing something that she called the self-care industrial complex. I'm just going to repeat that again because I think it's an amazing phrase. The self-care industrial complex. So as well as this notion of care like emerging within our sector, it has sort of emerged in the popular consciousness as this thing that's marketized. So, you know, in the age of neoliberalism, everything has become monetized. And I think we can see now that this notion of care or self-care has been delegated to the individual again. So just to throw that in there as something for us to bear in mind. So yeah, some of these questions and more will be explored today, but we're going to start with 2 5-minute presentations from Jack Quaintance and Khanyisile Mbongwa. So we're going to start with Jack Quaintance first. So Jack Quaintance is an interdisciplinary, it's so hard to say. Jack Quaintance is an interdisciplinary artist based in the UK Working across performance, sculpture, law, and policy making, his practice is an ongoing exploration of social justice that blurs the boundaries between art, law, governance, and consultancy. Looking toward alternative cosmologies and knowledge systems that predate Judeo-Christian or colonial narratives, Tan interrogates the legacies of colonialism with a particular interest in Commonwealth and tropical epistemologies of resistance. By questioning how embedded societal structures form our laws and guide our behaviour, Tan's work attempts to rethink our entanglement with the human and more than human world, and looks towards alternative ways of living and working. So Jack, thanks for being here today, and I'm just going to hand over the floor to you now, and we'll see you in 5. Well, I'll talk to you in 5.
Thank you, Morgan. I'm just going to jump straight in because I've only got 5 minutes. I am a because I'm stuck already. East Asian man with a shaved head. Think chubby Buddha in a gilet, the dark gilet, and you've got it. Okay. Many moons ago, I had a background in commercial litigation and what they call now conflict resolution in the sector. So contract disputes, property disputes, debt recovery. And I was also doing civil liberties casework, particularly actions against the police with regard to deaths in custody. So for me, conflict has been an interesting subject right from the start. And in particular, I'm interested in this idea of conflict in Anglo-Saxon legal systems and how it's conducted in an adversarial manner. And an adversarial meaning doing conflict where 2 or more parties are pitted against each other. And in an adversarial system, we deal with conflict by trying to determine a number of things. We try to determine what are the facts of the conflict. And by facts, I mean the post-Enlightenment meaning of facts, as opposed to any pre-colonial or non-European understanding of truth or reality. In a conflict, we try to determine who's to blame and what is the evidence to prove who is to blame. And then ultimately, we want to decide what is the remedy for the winner of conflict and what is the punishment for the loser. So in an adversarial conflict resolution process, ultimately, we are trying to determine who or what is right or wrong, correct or incorrect, genuine or fake, truth teller or liar, sinner or saint. So this concept of word conflict arises to me from a binary worldview. Or shall we say, put it another way, doing conflict in this adversarial way also reinforces the binary. So a large part of my art practice has been informed by these early legal experiences. And I've been exploring why we do conflict like this in society, and also why it doesn't really work. I mean, over the years, I found that conflict as fact-finding in order to allocate blame really doesn't help anybody. It doesn't do anything except to find blame. And it doesn't actually even do much to resolve the conflict because people still come away from the process angry, hurt, damaged, smug if you win, or wanting to have revenge if you lose. So the conflict isn't actually resolved. Therefore, in my practice, I have been exploring non-Western or non-Judeo-Christian cosmologies of conflict resolution, which often include care as part of the conflict resolution, care for the participants in the conflict process, but also care for community and wider society, because conflict, or even on an individual level, damages society. So it's about how do we repair the social fabric. But when I say care here, I'm also very aware that, like Morgan says, care is not only a neoliberal term, possibly, but it's also a Western term. Like this, our understanding of what care is already a Western term. So, and then just very briefly, because I've got 1 minute, so I'm going to show you 30 seconds each of the 2 projects that I think typify this. So this is a project like, ages ago, like 2015, I did this project, and it's called Karaoke Court. And it is a project where I invited people with real conflicts to agree under binding arbitration agreement to resolve their conflicts by karaoke singing before an audience. And the audience acts as the jury, and they will actually have legal power to decide who wins the conflict. And many non-European societies, not many, but there is evidence throughout the world that different non-European indigenous societies use singing as a way of conflict resolution, because what is presented is not just facts, but the whole being of a person in their vocality and in their voice, basically. And so people have to not only judge the facts of the case, they often have to judge who the person is as they are presented in their sociality and in their bodies. And I can tell you more about this on another time, but or you could just Google it and you can watch a video. And then the other one that I wanted to show you is this, which is an anti-racist partnership agreement that I created for Sheffield University to use with its organizations. And basically it's their partnership contract, but turned into a visual contract, but using their participants, because the participants come from different communities, different ethnic communities, using their cosmology to forefront the contractual term. And I'm over my time, but very quickly, for example, this term is the university's dispute resolution clause. But the dispute resolution clause you can see here at the bottom is like, it's like there as the full dispute resolution clause, but it's also incorporated into dispute resolution is this West African dispute resolution called the palaver hut system, where you have to go into a hut, and instead of just like having it out in conflict, you have to go into this hut to just meet each other and really kind of mediate with each other within the kind of African cosmological world, right? And so this, what I've tried to do here is to incorporate this methodology of dispute resolution into the university contract.
Very much, Jack. We'll be able to hopefully come back to some of that stuff in a sec. But so I'm going to pass it over to Khanyisile now. But before I do that, I'm just going to give you a quick biog. So Khanyisile Mbongwa is a Cape Town-based independent curator, award-winning artist and sociologist, with a curatorial practice centered around curing, care, and using creativity to instigate spaces for emancipatory practices, joy, and play. Mbongwa is a curator of Puncture Points, founding member and curator of 20 Journey, and former executive director of Handspring Truth Puppets. She's one of the founding members of the arts collective Googalective, Vasiki Creative Citizens, and a women of colour poetry collective called Rioters in Session. Mbongwa was the chief curator of the Stellenbosch Triennial in 2020, and I'm sure you all know that they were also the creator of the Liverpool Biennial in 2023, which is one of the best in the past 13 years. So Khanyisile, the floor is yours.
Thokozani, mna ndinguMbongwa uGadula uMbuyisa unyamazana kaMthimkhulu, ndinguKhumalo uMntungwa uMbulazi wazi umuntu emyenga ngendaba, ndinguMadondo uMthembu uMwelasi uQudeni uThukela, ndinguMabaso basentabeni Langahle kwaselishona, ndinguJola amaMpondomise amahle ntsima kushisa, Ombathana omgcina otshatshu Nthokozisa omthanti omtshalo Sithole nohlobo Thokozani. My name is Khanyisile Mbongwa. Before I speak in any form of gathering, I acknowledge my ancestors and my lineage, where I come from, because I am because they were, and I get to speak in whatever form because they have spoken before. And to also acknowledge those who are existing in plural, who walk with their ancestors and acknowledge their ancestral presence. I am a Black African woman with currently short hair that is black and I think goldish, yellowish. I am golden brown, have thick golden hoops and cat-eyed golden framed glasses. I'm wearing a black t-shirt written black on it. So I'm sitting on the floor of my living room in the heat of Cape Town. It is so hot. On the screen, you see a GIF that has been, sized down, that has a title saying "There's no table for my seat." And this is how I frame all my conversations. I don't know until when. And it's sort of a philosophy I'm looking at, thinking about the table, the construction of the table within a very Western form, and how in African culture and traditions, we come with our seats, and there is no table. We gather in different ways, and that you are born ordained to your particular seat and what your seat means in society. And so thinking about conflict and care, I've been thinking a lot about, the question of care in itself. And I really like what Jack said, is speaking about in terms of legalities and finding other ways of thinking about conflict outside this, what we have inherited as Western forms of thinking about, or, how inherited systems that are essentially Western and white in the world and function in particular ways to continue to not see us. So I've been thinking a lot about this word care and how the system normalizes itself in a way of conflict, right? Like the institution doesn't see itself in conflict because it has never had to negotiate its identity, but instead it has had to determine the identities of everyone else, what they do, what we do, how we are positioned, and what marks us in the world. And we can look at it in terms of colonized, colonizer, enslaved, enslaver, and how these already, in the legacy of these things, the institution is built. And I'm thinking a lot about institutions as a place where things go to die. And by that, I mean that as an independent curator, for instance, the system does not protect me at all. When I'm invited in any project whatsoever, there isn't, I don't have healthcare through that system. The labor law doesn't protect me. The care package in which the institution has is only reserved for permanently employed workers, and anyone who, like myself, comes in as an independent curator or a freelance, as we are called, does not have or is not afforded the same kind of protection by the system. And so the system in itself then becomes a space of conflict, unresolvable conflict, as Jack mentioned, like that the system in a way is built through these ideologies of conflict, but does not see itself through conflict. And, today I had so my talk is not as organized beautifully as Jack, but I had this conversation with an artist today doing studio visits. And this artist was talking, his name is Ronald Muchatuta, and currently his work is about him letting go of his refugee status in South Africa as a Zimbabwean and revisiting that, and how the system failed him and tried to recreate scenes of indignity as he was reclaiming and restoring his identity as a Zimbabwean man and letting go of his refugee status. Again, how the systems are always, in a way, not acknowledging the ways in which we exist in precarity, because it sees itself as how to identify, and create a particular space for people to occupy. And as he was talking, he kept on going back to this word dignity, and I was trying to think of this word of dignity in relation to care, in relation to repair, in relation to self-reconciliation. How do we self-reconciliate our history, our present, so we can imagine ourselves in spaces of care? How do we look at capacity as a formation? Like, what is our capacity to create a system for ourselves to care, but also in such a way that when we engage with institutions, we don't have to reproduce these scenes of violence to show the institution how much it doesn't care, right? Like, that we have to find a way that like our capacities are not stretched, or the institution doesn't force us into a space of stretching our capacity so we can prove a point that how the institution doesn't care. And again, thinking about reform and reclaim, what does that mean when one's dignity has been placed in question, when one's dignity has been placed put in a space of precarity, and what this relationship is between precarity and conflict. And, you know, in my head, I go back, there is no table for my seat. Because when these institutions were formed, and the legacies of all these institutions, we're talking about museums, we're talking about galleries, we're talking about funding structures. Generally, when they are initiated, they have not considered people who look like myself, who are Black, queer, Indigenous, people of color, and therefore can't see us or can't see me. And so how do you step into a space that does not have a perspective of who you are, but rather sees you, you know, from a place of precarity? You know, even the languaging which we use to, you know, we speak about previously disadvantaged communities, previously disadvantaged artists, even the languaging for me still, you know, maintains the state of conflict. And so this is where I would turn to my mother tongue and my culture to look for places of repair and care and commune and congregation. And in my language, in one of my mother tongues, there's a word, you know, that means to care, which is ukukhathala, which is in the word in itself, it already acknowledges tiredness, khathala, to be tired. So there's a way in which our mother tongues does something when we're thinking about these terminologies and ways of things in the world. So for me, I keep on returning back to language, my mother tongue, as a place where I can enact forms of care. So I can enact forms of care and think about care from that indigenous African knowledge, ancestral spiritual perspective, and use language as a way to move through that. And another person I think with quite closely is Bell Hooks, the late Bell Hooks, who talks about a love ethic. And I think in the world in general, we don't have a love ethic. Our politicians don't have a love ethic. The systems which we exist in don't have a love ethic. And I think in one of our conversations, Jack mentioned this thing of like, instead of thinking about care, how about we think about love, you know, and what happens when you move from a place of love? And I really like how Bell Hooks breaks this question of what is a love ethic, or how can we build a love ethic? And Bell Hooks writes, care, respect, responsibility, presentness, accountability, humility, spiritual growth, and really being invested in those properties, you know, particularly for me, like spiritual growth. When someone is interested in your spiritual growth, for you to grow in a spiritual way, they are, you know, connected to caring for you and figuring out like what care modalities you need rather than like what they think you need. You know, they will respect you. They might not understand you, but they will respect because they're truly invested in your spiritual growth. They will hold themselves accountable when something has happened. You do not need to be the one who checks them. And I think this is where the disparity and the disconnection for me happens with institutions, is that institutions don't know how to be responsible, respectful, and accountable. They are constantly asking people who have been already in sites of violence and have had to figure out how to navigate those identities that are steeped in violence and precarity, to figure out how do we care for ourselves, and then co-opt care principles and, you know, into what I would call institutional performances of care, and say, oh, now we have figured out how to care for you, without even doing the work to ask the questions internally. How are we a state of conflict? You know, so I think that's my 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Khanyisile. So basically, we've got quite a wide spectrum of responses from both of you, really. Jack was sort of coming down on this notion like binaries being like an overarching kind of structure that is orienting behaviors in ways that that are restrictive, from language to I guess the way institutions are functioning, and also this notion of like a legal conflict. Legal conflict resolution sort of producing binaries all the time. And then Khanyisile, it was interesting to hear you talking about how institutions will really, I guess one of the things that I was mentioning, just this notion of co-option of care, and what does it mean to then be somebody who is in need of care, but needs to also educate the system in how to take care of that. But what I'm going to do is, like, there's some questions already, so I'm going to jump to them. But hopefully we can keep this rolling by keeping everything pretty brief. Not to say like we have to cut it short, but one of the things I think with these sorts of conversations is that they could go in one direction, like for quite a while. So I'm just going to be mindful of people who are switching that direction so we can kind of cover enough ground. I hope that makes sense. But Jack, there's a quick question for you to start off with, which is a kind of practical one, I suppose. Like, how have the cosmology conflict resolution cards been received? And that comes from Ashley from Scotland.
Well,
from the MW Museum. So.
Yeah, very briefly, it was received very well by the people that I made it for, which were the participants and the partners. These 6 partners, civil society partners, who work with the Centre for Race and Inclusion, Equity and Inclusion at Sheffield University. So it's a contract signed between the Centre for Equity and Inclusion and these partners, and they asked for a bespoke contract partnership agreement. And so they've received it all very well. And what's wonderful is that some of them even use the cards, which is effectively their contract, for like internal training purposes. They use it in board meetings. Sometimes they use it like one group I know use it almost like a tarot. Like at meetings, they just pick a card from the deck and then read about whatever it is, termination or conflict resolution, as a way to remind themselves of the values that inform their partnership.
So do you feel like, Jack, I mean, this is a question for me because we haven't got one yet from the attendees, but that seems like a very sort of practical approach to changing behaviours in a given organisation. And what I like about it is that it's also, it's applicable across the board. It's like not just speaking to a kind of establishment. Like, you could take that, if me and Khanyisile are working together, we could probably use those cards. Was that in your mind as well, to try and think of something that wasn't just addressing this system that is like not really doing things for everybody?
Shall we say it's a way of kind of like a lot of my work, I'm really interested in this idea of bureaucratic activism. So very good, yes, let's call people out, let's protest, but then also let's actually make boring practical changes, because actually structural change requires structural tinkering. And so we have to do that work of changing contracts, changing policies, changing the way decisions are made in the boardroom, and just like at a very practical level. Because there's no point saying we want this particular kind of inclusiveness, and these are all on our websites and everything, but we're still using, shall we say, colonial structures to make. So it's like, again, it's like, you know, can you really use the master's tools without like, I think you can, but I think you've got to actually hack the tools, you know, because if you use the tools without hacking them, you just end up reproducing the colonialism or the sexism or whatever. So for me, it's about always hacking the tools, and this is one example of how we hack the tool of a contract.
Khanyisile, is that something that I'm just trying to think of, like how you have been like manifesting some of the ideas that you've been talking about. I mean, on one level, I know that there's a way that's a struggle where you're just telling people, but like, what about, you know, there's some more productive ways you found of working with your peer group and.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it also, like, I'm quite clear about contractual agreements, you know, and I think a lot of creatives need to really do that work of thinking about, like, because contractual agreements bind you, they also bind you energetically and spiritually, and so you need to figure out how to have a contractual agreement that does not, you know, hold you on your spine, you know, yeah, like, So one of the things I do from the very beginning, you know, whether I am negotiating, and this is where for most people it's scary, negotiating with a big institution. I'm just some girl from the township in South Africa. I grew up in the township. I'm ghetto, I'm hood, right? And these are part of my markers. And then you're negotiating with an institution that is super big, like a biennial or like a Tate. And of course, you might encounter a complex of like, who am I in this? And you have to remind yourself that your geographical location that you're born into is exactly the thing that founded you. And therefore you have every right to be in that room, first of all. So for me, that's like the first thing, to completely and utterly see yourself as deserving of being in that room, and that everything you're going to say is as valid, and everything that you demand is you're deserving of. So for me, that like, and this is why I start any conversation of this nature gathering with acknowledging my ancestors, because in that way, I'm inviting them to come with me. I'm also acknowledging the work they've done to prepare. So the next thing is to ask clarifications about their contract. Walk me through your contract. What what you have written here mean in actuality, right? And then the third thing is to come with my counter contract. That is so important. You know, you can consult with a lawyer, but also you can write down the things that are non-negotiable for you, your counter contract. And one of those things should be, no matter how big the institution is, and they invite you as a curator and artist, your intellectual property, you must make sure always belongs to you. That should they want to do anything after you've engaged with them, they have to come back to you. And whether you say like, in coming back, there will be a consultation fee, right? Because the way in which the system works, it knows how to protect itself. And in nature, it is like extractive, you know, and most of the institutions that we are working within and working through and negotiating with are all legacies, are colonial legacies. And in nature, they are extractive. Curating is an extractive practice. I've had to figure out how to be a curator from my positionality as a Nguni woman from Southern Africa, and what that means, and how not to reproduce the scenes of violence. So how do I enact this practice without upholding the legacy of colonialism and whiteness? So that's one practical way. Like, the contract is an important part to, and always don't be afraid to have a lawyer to be like, give me, if they say we need this back in 2 days, tell them you'll have it back in 5 days, because I need to consult my people. Like, you have that range. Institutions make you feel like you don't, but you do. And you get jobs. Even if they tell that you'll never get hired again because you're so difficult, they're lying to you. You'll get jobs. People will come. People, because you're amazing. And your ancestors are with you. And you're ordained by the divine intervention of God and Allah and Buddha and whoever. So you get employment.
So do you feel like, the stuff we were talking about now is sort of touching on that like sort of primal conflict really amongst creative people, which is like the conflict between the like administrator and the creative individual. Like, how do you switch between those two things? And it almost seems, Khanyisile, like you're saying, insert the contract in the first instance, and the sooner, insert the contract at the beginning of the relationship will help you get towards that relationship where it just becomes creative and less administrative. So that was just an observation, because I just want to bring in other people's questions, and mine aren't that important, but like, so we've got a couple of questions here, and I'm going to give you both of them, and then we'll see. Linda Devo says, how do we decolonize when steeped in it? It is hard to even know where one is playing out old conditioning as it runs so deep. Any tips on interrogating one's own colonized systems and ways of thinking and approaching conflict? So, Jack, do you want to go for that one? That's quite an intense.
Big question.
Maybe let's just rather than doing a kind of global answer, maybe just think of a specific instance.
Yeah, I suppose I can only talk from my own practice, which is that I am like a deeply colonized person. I was brought up in a British colony in Singapore, brought up to just like in my body and in my soul to think British is best, right? So it's like, how do I even begin when my beginning is deeply colonized, right? I was born into colonialism. So it's really to do with, for me, it's to do with the kind of what I kind of have started thinking of as a practice of mimesis, where it's about a constant reproducing of myself, but with each reproduction of myself, it's not a copy, but it's a kind of progression where I undo myself as I keep repeating myself. So it's like to continue to make the mistakes of colonialism, but then to reflect on it and realize, okay, I need to recreate myself again, rebirth myself again, but a little bit better next time. And so I kind of think of that. And I also think like maybe like I think about often in terms of like queering myself, like how do I queer everything that I think, that like, even like when you were saying, you know, like Morgan just now about how do we switch between the administrative and the creative, or the colonial and the non-colonial, I kind of think, all right, that's a moment where I can actually take that and then how do I queer it? How do I even like go, okay, maybe that's binary, you know, that the idea of switching itself is a binary. Maybe it's not about switching at all. Maybe it's about synthesis and then creating something new out of that synthesis through a kind of rebirthing of one's thinking. So it's a big question, but I think I would say that's my methodology.
Okay, Khanyisile, do you want to jump in on this one, or do you want to take another question?
I think Jack has it under control. We
All
can
right.
take it.
So we got a question from an anonymous attendee, which is about, do you think it's important to take people out of conventional methods of conflict resolution in order to break down barriers and facilitate conversation? I feel like we've answered that question. Specifically, Jack gave a concrete example with the cards. So I'm going to move on. One thing can I just add something to the decolonization question? So one thing I would say also is that when we're in a phase now where decolonization is very Western centric, but like the rest of the world has its own colonial relationships with its majority world partners. That's going to be another phase that we're going to have to enter into. And I think a part of decolonization is also recognizing how we feel safe in ideologies. Well, I want to move out of the West is the best, but maybe the rest is the best now. So it becomes the marginal subject as saint. You know, we need to just have a critical, skeptical mindset. I think there's one way to have like a colonial outlook in a kind of global way. But sorry, that was just a little little offering there. Khanyisile?
I just want to add just one line. My challenge with decolonizing or decolonization, which I am grateful for all the work people have done up to this point, right? But my challenge is that it still centralizes the colonizer. You constantly have to think of yourself in relation to a colonizer, you know? And for me, this is the challenge, is that it is almost like reinstituting colonialism from a different perspective of, you know, now you're the one, you know, who's allowing the colonizer to occupy so much space in your imagination and manifestation of yourself. And so for me, it has been thinking more about what are the emancipatory practices that have been happening since the moment we were colonized, right? How have our people been in this process of emancipating themselves? And what does it look like now, right? Where the center is not the colonizer, you know, that you are the center, you know, and in a practical sense, that begins with literally looking in the mirror and either acknowledge all the things you don't like about yourself because colonialism has taught you not to like them, and sit in that discomfort of not liking those things, and do that self-reconciliation work, like, oh, I don't like this about myself, not because I don't like it, but because I've learned how not to like it. Does that make sense? You know, I think that's, you know, the moment, like this reconciling with as Jack was saying, this like, you know, we are born into these colonial systems, you know, while we are still in our mother's wombs already, we are functioning in this inherited systems. And we come to be in them until one day we're like, oh no, this doesn't work. Oh no, honey, this does not work. No.
I want to add to that, almost like you really hit the nail on the head for me, where I was just thinking, oh yeah, decolonization, it's this kind of almost as if I think of it as kind of American cultural imperialism concept, right? Where it's like as if as if America and Britain had invented this word decolonization in the last 3 or 5 years, when I kind of think, well, my people have been decolonizing for 200 years, right? We've been, doing this work. So it's like, well, we just need to like think about non-Western versions of post-colonization, basically. And there are many academics and writers in Africa and Asia who've been doing this.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jack and Khanyisile. So we've got a few questions that have come in. I'm gonna let me just see. Okay, so Sarah Dixon says that she struggles to visualize, imagine a non-conflict based institution. Are there examples? I'm just going to read the few questions just to keep it rolling. Then Rowan is saying, I'm curious if Jack and Khanyisile can speak about care and resentment. I'm specifically thinking about class in the UK and the feeling of not belonging and not being welcome in the arts. I ask myself how I can recognize but also address this belief within myself and those I work with, and what it means to even address this conflict. And the last question, which I think relates to the first, is from an anonymous attendee again. And it says, I sometimes struggle with the tension between the independent individual and the institution. Isn't the institution also just people and individuals, some of whom are actually working on the change and equity on the inside? Is it helpful to see the institution as inherently anti-care and pro-conflict? So I guess the first question about, is there an institution that's non-conflict based? Can we think of any examples? And the third question about there are good people within institutions. How do we navigate that? Do we not work with them, or do we work with them? They're kind of related. Khanyisile, do you have anything to offer on them ones?
Non-conflict institutions, I think I would not call them, I don't think they would be institutions, first of all. I mean, because our concept, and I'm positing this as a thing, that we either all agree in this gathering now that what we mean by institutions is like a Western Eurocentric form of gathering that has very specifically created itself over the last 500 years as the world order or the universal order, and having a say in people's lives in geographical locations, not only by violently removing people into other locations, but then making them an unpaid labor for so institutions, right? So this is what they're built on conflict and violence. What we have inherited as museums, and I'm even talking about new museums that emerge, because they function within that same order of recreating themselves within an image that is familiar, that seems accessible to a certain diaphragm, right? So institutions, and I'm positing that is that what we're agreeing institutions are. That's what we're talking about. There are other forms of gatherings that are non-conflict based, and within the art world, the first one is a collective. A collective is a gathering of people that have either a shared vision, but different perspectives on how to get to that vision and work together towards that. And in the process are constantly figuring out ways of caring for each other in order for this thing to happen. So their coming together is not against something, but towards each other, right? Non-conflict. Cooperations, co-ops that sometimes are made by, and I'm talking in this sort of, to promise Lungu, now George, George, English has just escaped my mouth. Metropolitan, like in the metropolitan setting, when you think of co-ops and, in the sort of capitalist system, people coming together from particular geographical locations, trying to function in the economy and come together and open a co-op again. They're moving towards something because they've realized that the system does not know how to cater and hold them. So for me, those are like very basic two examples. My mom, for instance, is in her 60s, 70s, has been working for 4 years with a huge group of Black women, over 50 people, trying to start a fish co-op in Cape Town as Black women from the township. And they're working towards this one thing. What they're in conflict with is the system, because the government system is just like, well, we don't know how to receive you. Does that make sense? Like as practical examples of how non-conflict examples. But I think when we speak about all these other institutions, like we talk about prisons, we talk about policymakers, they all form part of the legacy because, you know, if you think from an African perspective, you know, when we speak about post-colonial or Independence Day, we're talking about colonial legacies and all the structures, you know, even in South Africa being a British/Dutch colony. Most of the stuff we use are all still like legacies of colonial conduct, conflict. They do not see us. They don't know how to recognize us. They don't know how to read us. They are not interested in that.
Okay, thanks, Khanyisile. Jack, do you want to take those questions?
Yeah, so I was just going to add to what Khanyisile said about that. For me, like institutions, I really, you know, I really agree with this idea, this definition of institutions that we're using. And if we use this definition, I would say that institutions have an architecture of power, and they are generally kind of hierarchical because that's the best way to concentrate power in a few people at the top, right? So this is the way institutions are built, because logistically, colonially, it's very important to centralize power. You know, in the British Empire, let's center it in England, so that this shape, we're able to then rule very, very wide land masses and many people. So it's a logistical, practical solution, right? And it's just that if you create this architecture, that architecture creates a particular kind of stress through the system. So that architecture creates these stresses, which we call conflict, right? And then we need to resolve those stresses or conflicts through what I already explained, which is adversarial conflict resolution processes, which then create, I think, really beautifully said, a way of not seeing, as Khanyisile says, you know, that conflict resolution, in order to maintain the hierarchical power system, can only see certain facts and not others. You know, can see facts and not bodies, can see evidence and not relationalities. So that's why I think that's what happens. And this idea that institutions are individuals, I would say, yes, institutions are made up of individuals, but on top of the individuals, there's a kind of like, it's got its own life, you know, like institutions have a kind of bureaucratic, systemic life that keeps repeating itself in spite of all the good intentions of individuals. So yes, it's made up of individuals, but it's also separate. And I mean, care and resentment is an interesting question, because I would say a lot of what I've done in the last few years, particularly like with whistleblowing, I view it as a form of care and rage. You know, like we take action against an institution as artists or as freelancers, not because we want to have revenge, because it's just not worth it. It really actually is not worth to go public, and that is way too much energy. But you do it because you care, and you have anger because you care. So there's this kind of like, how do we, shall we say, keep care within anger and not go to resentment or bitterness, is my short answer for that.
So I'm just going to double back to Rowan's question again, just because you mentioned resentment there. But Rowan's clarified, says, I'm specifically thinking about class in the UK and the feeling of not belonging and not being welcome in the arts. I asked myself, how can I recognize but also address this belief within myself and those I work with, and what it means to even address this conflict? So feeling uncomfortable because of, I suppose, their class position, and what can they do with that feeling of discomfort? Do with or do about? I mean, I have something to say if you guys need a slight break. So I would argue that, like, this is one of those areas within the history of Britain that needs to be addressed, but often gets lost sometimes. So essentially, the history of working class in Britain is one which has been buried, but it is huge, active, and arts literate. So I think one of the theorists that does a lot of work in relation to this that I think is really worth looking at is someone called Pierre Bourdieu. That's a little bit difficult to look at, but there's books like Distinction, where he discusses like the formation of taste and the notion that some people are born with it and some people aren't, which I think is this distinction between class. Somehow the working class are supposed to be people who are without a culture, and that to access culture, you have to move into the bourgeoisie to access it. But by doing that, you sacrifice where you're from, and you also feel like an imposter where you land. But that's the thing where you're sort of thinking about being working class as being in possession of no cultural capital. But if you really think about what's happening in this country and what's happened before, the working classes possess quite a lot of cultural capital, but you tend to have to do a lot of archaeology to find those individuals who came from those backgrounds and who made it in the cultural sector. But there's loads of them. Another book that I would really suggest is a book called Them and Us by a writer called John Newsinger. And he's someone who tracks the history of the working class in the UK, specifically in the 20th century. But yeah, maybe that's from an academic perspective, but this is like one of those things that comes up every generation. And I think it's because this country does a real job on the working class to erase its own history. It's almost like a subject position that's being marginalized from the inside. So that's my 2 cents on that. But Khanyisile, do you want? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not from a British context. It's just maybe as someone who moves around, you know, class is a major thing in the arts. I think a lot of people come into the arts thinking it's this liberal space where, and it's not, you know, class also for some reason determines like how and when we are taken seriously, and we find ourselves having to work. I mean, I come from, and this is why actually I always mention where I come from, because it's important for me for people to have the background of the kind of labor one has had to do to be wherever I'm at. So I come from in South Africa it's called like poor to working class background. And so, which means that I'm first generation to go to university. And there are all these stereotypes of like unculturedness of people who come from my positionality, which is untrue, because if you actually look at how culture is defined, it's usually defined by the people who practice it. And most of the time it is working class people. And one of the things in which, you know, for me that are very practical is when you are, for instance, negotiating a contract, people who have class will say to you, you can't mention money the first moment you are in conversation with someone, because that also reveals your class. But what that does is that it then puts you in a predicament that by the end of you've been doing this work and then you don't get paid for your labor because you are trying to negotiate some class distinction thing about, you know, you are from an upper class bourgeoisie and therefore you understand capital in a certain way. But this is also how like upper class bourgeoisie people maintain their wealth, by ensuring that they keep a particular frame restored and sturdy on the ground, so that one feels that if they act in particular ways, they show where you're from. But I think one way to destabilize class is actually to stand exactly where you're from, because where you're from informs how you exist and what you make of yourself in the world. You know, it's one way to, you know, I mean, I don't like this, I don't usually use the term disrupt, but I think it's one way to move in English, into your kangela, English guys, English is gone, George is gone. George is gone. I can't find the English translation of the word I'm looking for. George sometimes leaves.
Okay, do you want to, I'll let you take a break, and then Jack, do you want to jump in on the class question?
Just briefly, I kind of feel like to think about class and the arts, you kind of have to go back to the beginnings of museums in the UK. I mean, just within the UK context, like why were museums created? Why was the British Museum created? Why was the National Gallery created, right? During the Victorian era, which was this kind of, I suppose, quite snobbish idea that the working classes are kind of morally or culturally inferior, and we needed to like raise their level, shall we say, right? And so not only did they do this within the UK to create the V&A and all these places, but also the museums as a way of raising the level of the natives in the empire as well, to make them the better individual that we think society should be, according to the worldview of a particular group of upper-class Victorians, shall we say. So I think for me, like, there's always this like working against trying to, like, it's always a question of like, how do you access high culture? How does a working class person access high culture, which is kind of where the origins of it were. So I suppose for me, it's like, how do we even get rid of this originating question? How do we stop contemporary art feeling like the language of contemporary art and the products of contemporary art are this particular set of things, right? Why can't contemporary art simply be, can incorporate what was traditionally the cultural production of the working classes, you know? So for example, very starkly, we see, for example, let's take a clear example of, say, male and female art. So for a long time, it was men in art. And so therefore, things like quilt making, textiles were just not included in the history of art. But now we just need to challenge the very aesthetics and criteria of contemporary art in order, I think, for some equality to come in, be that class or gender or race.
Okay, thanks, Jack. So we've got another question at the bottom here. There's been some observations on answers and questions that have already been posed. So I'm just going to jump to the question below that. So Vicky Thea says, could the panel please speak on their experience of resolving conflict created when trying to care for people with differing needs, personal needs, and in terms of the art they're working on? Khanyisile, do you want to?
Ask questions. You have to move from a place that you actually don't know. I think a lot of people who, or a lot of us who work within the space of like, we care, sometimes forget to ask questions and say, actually, to move from a place like, I actually don't know how someone else needs to be cared for. Because one, that recognizes your own limitation, and also like shows the expansiveness of your capacity, right? So you ask someone, you know, first, like, are you comfortable with me asking you what kind of care you need? And then move on from there. Because when you operate from a place of knowing that we know how exactly to care, then we sort of have a format. And I don't think there's an exact format when you're working with different people. There can be a standardized thing of like, this is where I move from a caring place, but I'm very much aware that your needs might be different, and therefore, can we have a creative space that becomes a safe space for both of us, for me to learn how to care for you, and for me to ask questions when I might misunderstand what kind of caring you might need, which is very different from an expectation of you, Morgan, telling me like, you know, you need, you know, me expecting you to just tell me what kind of care you need. The first point of caring is to ask a question like, you know, how is this space making you feel? You know, is this a space that you feel you can be held? You know, am I holding you in an appropriate way? You know, so those questions can start there to like, to show to sort of exercise as the carer, you know, that you have a certain awareness. And then the second part of it, which is the most difficult part, is listening. We don't know how to listen. We all know how to talk and verbalize, because that's what we are taught to, like, be expressive. You need to speak out for yourself, and that has been at the expense of listening. And I think, you know, listening to hear exactly what the person is saying and not what you think the person is saying. Listening not to respond to the person, but to actually hear them, which are, you know, different types of listening, so that you can have, check in with yourself if you have the capacity for the kind of care they need, or whether you need to source it somewhere else.
And Jack?
I think what jumps out at me is this kind of phrase, differing needs. And I think all I would add to this is that I totally agree with what Khanyisile said, but what I would add to that is that for me, what I try to hold at the forefront of my mind is that difference is the world. Like, difference is actually what makes the world perceivable, and difference is what creates the world. So it's like if you put your hand on the table like that, you actually don't know, you just don't feel it. You don't feel it. It's only when you move it and there is a kind of difference, moving as difference, then you actually begin to perceive the world. And it's the same for me. So it's like when I encounter someone with different needs, I don't kind of think, or I try not to think, we should equalize our needs or make everything the same. I just kind of go, oh, this difference is just the norm. And so it really is like, how do I receive the difference? And my difference meets their difference, and we begin there. So I know it's not a direct answer to the question, but it's almost like a kind of approach.
Whoops, I was muted there. So we're coming sort of to the last 9 minutes, I think, of this session. We've got one speaker from one question from an anonymous attendee, which is about, do you have any comments in relation to conflict and care in artist-participant relationships? I sort of feel like we've addressed that. So I have a question I'd like to put to you, which is a question I've been asking myself, actually. As an artist, we seem to have moved from a phase or an era of considering aesthetic questions to considering questions to do with ethics. And it almost seems like there's a kind of imperative for us to step into this space. I wonder, do you both think about that tension? Is it important to you? Or have you felt it as a tension between, on the one hand, being a kind of socially vigilant and responsible citizen, and then somebody who wants to think in maybe quite abstract and rarefied terms? How do you resolve that conflict within yourselves, or do you even feel it? Khanyisile, I'll start with you because Jack, actually maybe Jack, I'll start with you because you had quite a quick answer to that.
I mean, yes, when I was in art school, I used to have this conflict, because when I was in art school, there was this, in my art school, there was this kind of like idea of like pure art, you know, like strict aesthetic art that's just to do with the object or light or painting or whatever form, you know. And anybody who kind of, well, in my year, anybody who kind of did politics in art, or addressed political issues was deemed to be a bit like, you know, that's not pure art, you know. But actually, you know, when I think about it, everything is political. Like even an old master's painting a bowl of fruit. There are kind of, you cannot separate the political from the aesthetic, and that's how I've kind of got to this point where even the bowl of fruit, a bowl of bananas, you have to kind of go, but where? How is it that there's a bowl of bananas in a Dutch painting? I mean, like, what trade routes happened there, and how did that rich person got to eat a pineapple? You know, so it's all there for me. So no problem.
Can I see that?
That's an interesting answer, Jack. I really love that answer. You know, I love that answer because I think for a long time, Black people, people of color, queer people, you know, only their art was read as political. If they make a rose, if a Black person paints a rose with thorns, it's, you know, versus a white person. So there's like a whitewashing that happens with like historically how white people painted stuff as if they were apolitical. It was just like this aesthetic. It never was just aesthetic, you know, just, you know. So for me, that's quite an interesting, like, yeah, thank you, Jack. I think we have no choice but to be ethical. to have ethics in our practice right now because we are in conflict with the planet. There is no choice but to be ethical because there is a deep conflict. We have heard like the planet cannot take more. You know, it cannot hold anymore, it cannot sustain anymore. And if we continue not to be ethical in thinking about anything that we do and how we live our lives and how we produce, you know, it is not the planet that will collapse, we will collapse into the planet. You know, and people keep on thinking the planet is not we, you know, we are the danger to the planet. We are in conflict, in deep conflict. And I think because of that, you know, when we make work, whatever work, there's ethics in our aesthetics, in whatever we do, you know. And I think there's no, for me, there hasn't been a separation, but rather a heightening of having to be super and ultra aware that, for instance, I traveled so much during the, you know, the biennial, trying to meet artists and like, how do I mitigate that? And the mitigation of that, I was just like, I have to find a producer who has the sensibilities of figuring out what kind of material we can use if we're producing new work that is not going to further the damage to the earth, right? I'm not decreasing it, I'm mitigating it. And just having that awareness and be like, okay, so in the next phase of whatever I do, how do I move beyond the mitigation, you know, and just building on the, but the aesthetics are still there, alive and thriving. You know, asking questions, do we need to build more museums? Do we need to collect more art? Do we need to make more art that is collectible? These are the ethical questions we need to ask ourselves while making beautiful things about horrible realities in the world, right? Like, we are in conflict. We need ethics as a form of guidance and a guideline and a lifeline to remind us that we are busy swallowing ourselves and we think that it is the planet that will collapse, but it is us. So, yeah.
Thank you, Khanyisile, and thank you, Jackie Tan. So we've come to the end really of our discussion here. I hope everybody's been enlivened by it. It's quite high octane. There was no dead air, was there? We filled it with timely reflections on care and conflict. So I've been your host, Morgan Quaintance. Didn't describe myself in the beginning, so I'm going to do it now. Oh no, it's quite hard to do, isn't it? I can't just say like chilled guy who's into the arts, can I? Because that's not descriptive. So I don't know. I suppose male presenting, black man with brown skin. I need a shave. I've got a bit of a beard and my hair's a bit long, and I'm sitting in my living room in front of a lamp, and the light is getting darker. But that's about it, I think. Thank you so much again for joining us today, and thanks to Jackie Tan and Khanyisile Mbongwa. And I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth Del Prete now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. A huge thank you to everyone. What a dynamic event with loads of questions and insights from both you know, members of the audience, but also from like all the speakers. What alternative forms of gathering enable us to decentralize power? That was like one note that I made to myself. And how do we move beyond an adversarial notion of conflict by creating something new through synthesis? Really, really exciting to hear this talk. Thank you also to Suzanne Merrick, our British Sign Language interpreter, for this event. And also thank you to everyone for your questions and comments. A quick note to say that our projects will host a seminar session online on the 22nd of March to continue this conversation, along with the many other conversations and key points that have emerged through the program over the course of 2023, and now with this event early in 2024. There is so much knowledge in the room every time we host an event, whether that is online or in person. And we want to create a format that enables more exchange, because we recognize that the webinar format doesn't always create opportunities for a two-way dialogue, although I thought Morgan did a great job at taking loads of questions today. So thank you so much for doing that. So we invite you to take part in the seminars to reflect on some of these considerations. It will be online, open to any artist, curator, producer, or creative practitioners active or interested in the expanded field of public arts. Places will be limited, so do look out for our next newsletter and book your free place. We really want to listen and build on your feedback for future events. So if you have a minute, do fill out our survey. It will ask questions, general questions around this event and the program more generally. And I think my colleagues are just about to add the link to the chat. Also, we will upload a recording of today's event on our YouTube channel that will include closed captions and the BSL interpretation. So you'll be able to view that from our website. And as you saw on our slides, we do endeavor to keep the Constellations program free for participants and event attendees. If you're able to make a donation, we really appreciate it as it helps keep the program free. There is a link to donate in the Zoom chat and also via the QR code. And finally, a huge thank you to our amazing speakers, Morgan, Jack, and Khanyisile, to the Arts Council of England, Barrington Hibbert Associates, the Constellations patrons and supporters for supporting the program, to our partners, Flattime House and Liverpool Biennial, to Suzanne Merrick, and also to everyone in the team at our project. Thank you so much.